Hello all, I hope you enjoyed your first lab for the woody plant identification class. I know that we went through a lot of information in that lab, but somehow I still forgot to talk about one small detail, and that is twig terminology. So I thought I'd do this short recording for you today, just to get you started with some of the terminology that we learn about in winter identification, because it's important to know about that now before winter comes around. So during the first lab, we spoke a lot about how to identify woody plants in summer, and we realized that the best starting place for this is to look at the leaves. We looked at 3 things to do with leaves. We looked at how leaves are arranged on the stem. We looked at if leaves were simple or compound in complexity. And we also looked at the leaf shape and the leaf margin. Now these 3 things hold true in summer when we do actually have leaves available on the plant, but what about in winter? Well, in winter, we can actually still use leaf arrangement to tell us something about the identification of the plant. But because we have no leaves available, we have to look at some new twiggy features instead. So talking about that leaf arrangement, here we have a diagram of a twig with absolutely no leaves available. This is a twig in winter. And firstly, we have something called the leaf scar. This is the area where the leaf was joined in summer, but is no longer there because it fell off as it senesced during fall, leaving the scar behind. Talking about leaf arrangement, we can still see that these leaf scars are arranged in an alternating fashion, and so we know that this plant did have an alternate leaf arrangement. But what is going on inside this leaf scar, this very strange pattern? Well, those little dots are what we call bundle scars, and they are actually the remnants of the vascular tissue that would have moved from the stem and into the leaf. When the leaf fell off, that vascular tissue also left a scar. The arrangement and the number of these bundle scars inside the leaf scar can tell us something about the identification of a plant. Sometimes plants only have 1 bundle scar, sometimes they have 3, sometimes the bundle scars are big and obvious, and sometimes they're very small. These little details can help us in our identification. What's interesting is we can also see something of stem features. For example, we know that the area where a leaf is joined is called a node, and the area between 2 leaves is called an internode. These features are definitely still available to see on a winter twig. And then finally, very interestingly, above our leaf scar, over here and over here, you can see something we call a bud. This bud is the embryonic tissue that will grow into a new branch the following season. And we always find this embryonic tissue, this bud, above a leaf scar. Now, buds come in very, very different shapes and sizes and colors and textures, and all of that information will help us in our winter identification. When we do our special workshop on winter identification, we will go into more detail about buds in particular. And then on this particular twig diagram, we can see this weird cap at the top of the twig. It doesn't look, it's just a flat sort of circular piece. It doesn't look like it has the characters of the bud at all. It doesn't have any scales. This is something that we call a tip scar. What's happening here is that the last part of the growth of a branch has fallen off over here as the twig is senescing. leaving behind the last bud over here that will become the new growth. But where that branch was joined, it's senesced, it's left another scar, and that's what we call a tip scar. Now, it's important to differentiate between a tip scar at the top of the twig versus an actual bud at the top of the twig, and that's what we're going to see in our next diagram. Before that, just one more small feature. We can see these little dots on the twig. These are what we call lenticels. Quite often the twig will have quite a dark color, like a dark brown color, and generally these lenticels can be quite pale in color, normally white or cream, and they look like little dots on the twig. What this lenticel is doing, it's actually just sort of a breathing pore, allowing oxygen into the twig for the tissues inside to be able to receive oxygen. But lenticels can play an important role in identification. Some species have them, some species you can't really see them that well. So all of these little details can aid us in our identification. So talking about that tip scar versus bud, here we can see a twig, and the top of the twig looks very different to the previous twig. There's the previous twig where we have our tip scar at the top, and our new twig has this massive bud at the top and no tip scar. What's going on here is the fact that we have a terminal bud, whereas in the previous twig we actually only had the last remaining lateral bud. So it's important to differentiate if a twig has a terminal bud that's very prominent and obvious and normally bigger than a lateral bud, as in this case here. This terminal bud will, in the following summer, become the new growth. And when that happens, this bud will burst open in the springtime. These scales over here will fall off, and they actually leave scars of their own. Anytime a woody plant has some type of growth that then senesces, we find that it leaves a scar behind, and these scars are very telling. So these scales over here, when they fall off in spring as the bud bursts, they leave scars. And they are what we call bud scale scars over here. And what this actually helps us to tell is the amount of growth that happened in 1 year. So right here I have, this is where the old bud was, and then this spring the bud burst and the branch grew this much up to here. And so we can see how much growth happens in each year. And then I was talking about the difference between a terminal bud and a lateral bud that's found on the side. Here you can see this lateral bud is much smaller in proportion to the very large and obvious terminal bud. But don't forget, not all species have terminal buds. And one final note about this twig is that you can see that the leaf scars are oppositely arranged. So we know that in summer the leaves themselves were oppositely arranged. One final scar to talk about. Here we have another twig diagram, and we have a terminal bud at the top. It's a strange shaped terminal bud, but a terminal bud it is. And we have our leaf scars and our bundle scars inside our leaf scars. Then we have these weird circular rings that seem to be coming off the leaf scars. These are what we call stipule scars. Now you might ask yourself, well, what on earth is a stipule? A stipule is a little leaf-like appendage that's joined to the bottom of the petiole where the petiole joins the stem. And when the stipule falls off, it tends to fall off sort of midsummer. It leaves a scar behind on the twig, and you will see that scar in wintertime. Some species have stipules and some species don't have stipules, so the presence or absence of that scar can help us in an identification. And just finally, here is a picture of what this little stipule would look like in summer. So this over here is the leaf itself, and then this is the little leaf-like appendage at the base of the petiole called the stipule. And when this falls off, it leaves a big scar over there, coming off the top of the leaf scar. So that's all for now. We're sure to cover more winter terminology in our actual workshop for that later on in the semester, but this was just a quick video to try and introduce you to some of the terminology that you might hear us speak about during our field trips.